the legendary cruising has become very much part of the DNA of thousands of Irish-bred horses. The Hartwell Stud sire made his mark in the international arenas across the world, and he has become a prolific sire over the years.
Cruising was born here at Hartwell Stud 29 years ago. And I think he's a very lucky horse, because I can't say that there's too many horses that were born and now live in and probably will die at the stable that they were born in.
Well, little did we know that a week after filming took place, that Cruising would pass away here in this stable.
I was asked by Borden Goppel to take Seacrest Cruising's sire, who's a registered Irish draft. Very luckily, being a registered Irish draft, he was the most beautiful mover, but his granddam was actually a thoroughbred mare by RTQ, so that's what gave him the lovely movement. And he was a super jumper for his day. He was very compact and he made a super shape over a pole. But we brought home Seacrest anyway, and while I was at the stud collecting him, I saw this mare in the field and I said, well, what's that mare there? And I was told by the manager at the time that it was Mullacrew. Mullacrew had been known as Nordell before, and she'd been retired by the army, who had jumped her, and she was here in this stud. I knew that Joe McGrath, who was in Borden Goppel at the time, had you know, a great feeling for her because he had owned her. So I rang him up and said what was happening with her, and he said that she hadn't bred for 2 years. And then about 2 days later he rang me up and he said, would you ever collect Mullacrew and see could you cover her with Seacrest? So there's what happened.
Well, that great mating resulted in Cruising. Born chestnut, later turned grey. And let's hear the rest of his story from Mary.
As a 2-year-old, he started this business of roaring his head off every time he saw a mare, which I can tell you was very annoying in a yard. So I got a bit annoyed, and I was going on my holidays in the February that he was coming up to 3. And Edward Doyle was with us at the time, and I can remember saying to Edward, if you don't teach that horse to lunge before I come home and see does he jump a pole, because I said if he doesn't jump a pole he's going to be castrated, because I'm sick of him. So I hadn't even gone on my holidays when Edward came up and said, well, he's learned to lunge in 2 days. And he said, you better come and see this, because I've just jumped him over a foot-high pole, and he gave it 6 foot. So he wasn't castrated, as you can see. Cruising has never been easy, least of all when he was a young horse. And we were extremely lucky at the time when he was being broken that we had a girl with us from Australia called Jane Goldsworthy. And she did a marvellous job on him, but I think she was on the ground more often than she was on his back. And then my daughter rode him, and she definitely was on the ground more than he was on his back. Poor old Jenny was bounced off the floor, I don't know how many times. But it was a lovely story to end, because Jane, we hadn't seen her for 25 years, and she arrived in Dublin on the Sunday just in time to see Cruising. And I think she couldn't believe that he was now white. When she'd had him, he was a really dark grey, dapple grey, with spots all over him. So she was delighted to see him and couldn't believe that he was still going after riding him 25 years ago. I'm not really pushed into jumping young horses too much, and certainly not as a 4-year-old. And then as a 5-year-old he went to Paul Dara. In those days, if you were competing internationally, you were allowed to nominate horses to jump in Dublin. And Cruising had definitely not had more than, I'd say, about 8 shows, if even 8 shows. So in trepidation I went to Dublin for what was then the Guinness, which was the 5-year-old class that everybody wanted to win in the main arena. And Paul nominated Cruising. He didn't have to qualify, he was nominated. And I was really a bit shook about this, because when I went to see the fences they were very big. And it was a 3-round competition in the main arena, and I thought, God, he wouldn't jump the wall up in the north, he's hardly going to go round here. But he jumped 2 fabulous rounds, and then he went against the clock, and I think he won it by 4 seconds. So I think people then realised that we did have something. As a 7-year-old, he went to Trevor, and Trevor didn't know whether he'd get on with him. And I actually said to Trevor, well, if you're not going to get on with him, he's going out of the country, he's going to John Whittaker, because I'd always marred John. Trevor decided he'd have a go, and he said he was like riding a motorbike. So he put a lot of work into him and got him going, and then we had some good results at the end of our 7-year-old year. I think he won the Grand Prix in Mill Street. He won the Grand Prix in Mill Street as a 7-year-old, and then started to go to some shows and jump, you know, in the smaller classes for a few months, and then gradually came up. And I think as an 8-year-old, He went to Pavarotti's show in Modena in Italy, and they won the Nations Cup. He had 2 clear rounds and won the Nations Cup. He was a very lucky horse all his life, because I never would let him jump in more than 3 shows, and then he came back to Ireland. I think he probably was the horse that had travelled most. When you're on the continent, you don't have to go too far, but Cruising had to cross 2 seas every time he came home. And I do feel that keeping him fresh, he's very Irish, and keeping him fresh and well in himself and just doing 3 shows was an answer to keeping him at the level that he achieved, and then stayed at that level. I think it was in 1997 when Cruising was on the winning Nations Cup team 4 times. Then there's one thing to say about him. He was never, in all the years he jumped in Nations Cups, which was 5 years, he was never the discard score. He always, his score, whatever it was, counted, and usually it was very low. The first year Cruising was used as a stallion, he was used by some people that remembered the old breeding, the breeding of the Dinzeo brothers and Mancinelli, and all the good Italian riders that had all our Irish horses out here. And they remembered that breeding, and they sent their mares. And the first year as a 3-year-old, he covered 12 mares, or he had 12 foals. I think he covered 14 mares and had 12 foals. And of those foals, it's amazing to say that 10 of those foals went international. And I think that must be an unbelievable record. 2 of them were kept as brood mares, and the rest of them went international. And one of the ones that I remember most was Harry Marshall's mare, Cruise Line. She was a great servant to Harry for years. And then people began to sort of use them. But Ireland's a funny old place, you know. They take likes and dislikes, and it took a long time before they used them enough. And I often think that if he'd been used like some of the foreign horses, now we'd have so many more horses by Cruising and mares by Cruising that would have helped our traditional Irish bred along the route now that it's faltering on with so few mares to cover. With Cruising at the age of 29 and not breeding anymore, it would be great to see somewhere along the line that we can produce another traditionally Irish bred stallion that will come up to what Cruising was able to do, and we need it badly. So let's hope somewhere out there's something that's going to be bred that's going to bring us back to the front of breeding worldwide.